Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Eduardo Suarez. I'm the head of communications of the Reuters Institute. And, as many of you know, our mission is to explore the future of journalism worldwide. We are not going to stop because of this pandemic. And we are doing this series of webinars. We started with Rasmus Nielsen and with Anne Schultz. We can see both webinars on our website. And today we are very lucky. Our speaker is Mira Selva. She is the director of the Journalist Fellowship Program of the Reuters Institute. And she's also the co-author of a recent fact sheet on women and leadership in the news media in 2020. She will speak a bit about that. And here are the rules of the webinar for some of you that is probably your first time. After this brief introduction, Mira will show her presentation. We'll speak for about 40 minutes or so. We will mute every microphone and hide every camera. So please keep both that way so everyone can actually follow the speaker. And of course, you can send any questions that you have at any time, but dropping us a message through the chat function. I will be checking that. And we'll, ask questions to Mira, as many questions as possible after she presents. The webinar will finish around 2:30 UK time, so in an hour or so. And without further ado, Mira, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Eduardo, and welcome everyone. Really hope you're keeping safe at this time. I'm very pleased to be talking about this issue of women and leadership in the news media. This is based on a fact sheet that we wrote at the Reuters Institute. Simja Andy, one of our researchers who's on this call, was the key author, and Rasmus Nielsen also participated. We decided to look at this issue because we wanted to start tracking the leadership issue of leadership in media and to see if there are any global trends. And this is something we plan to do over time. So this is the first of the fact sheets that we've done. And it was published on March the 8th, International Women's Day, with data collected from February 2020. So everything that's in this fact sheet was done before the coronavirus really hit Western Europe, and we understood the scale of what was coming through. But I will talk a little bit about the fact sheet of this presentation, but I'll then go on to talk a little bit about what this means in terms of reporting, and especially in terms of reporting pandemics and social changes. I'd also be really interested in a discussion with you amongst women and leadership styles. It's very striking commentary at the moment that the countries that are seeming to manage their crisis most effectively are ones that are led by women. So there is now a discussion again about whether this is because of a difference in style or a difference in substance. And I think it'll be something, I don't want to draw specific conclusions, but it'll be something very interesting to draw out in the discussion. I'll start by sharing a screen. So I'll disappear now, and hopefully you see this on the screen now. Is that okay? Okay. So this fact sheet is Women and Leadership in the News Media, evidence from 10 markets. And as I said, this was data that was collected at the start of this year. And what we wanted to look at is who are the leaders in the news media. We used our digital news report as a starting point. This is an annual report that looks at patterns of digital news consumption in 38 different countries worldwide. We picked 10 to represent a proper geographic spread: the USA, UK, Germany, Finland, Brazil, Mexico, Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and South Africa. And we looked at the top 10 markets online and the top 10 markets offline, top 10 brands, sorry, online and the top 10 brands offline in each of these countries. So 200 outlets altogether. And by top 10, I mean by reach as defined in the digital news report. And again, that data is on the fact sheet. Why we wanted to look at this is, well, because the top editorial positions in major news outlets matter both substantially and symbolically. Substantially, it matters who's making decisions, it matters who's in charge, and it matters in terms of representation in society. And it matters symbolically because it's important for women to be at the top of public-facing institutions such as the media, not least because these institutions are meant to be serving the whole of society, and it would be impossible to argue that they're truly serving the needs of all their audiences if all the decisions are only being made by part of society. And what we looked at was top editors, and this was defined as editors-in-chief or the heads of news. We looked at this by we gathered these names by looking at the media organizations themselves, by looking at their websites. We double-checked the data by asking our former journalist fellows, who are mid-career journalists who've been on our fellowship program through the years in each of these countries. And we also looked at it with our research team at the Reuters Institute. And we also reached out to several press officers to ask them to verify who they would class as the editor-in-chief or head of news. Not all of them replied, but where they did, we took their word for it. This does mean that we have some curious anomalies. And if I click on the next slide, this is a list of top editors in Britain. We have Emma Tucker, who will be editor of the Sunday Times. We have Rula Khalaf, who's editor of the Financial Times. Fran Unsworth, head of news at the BBC. Victoria Newton, who's been appointed editor-in-chief at The Sun. Kath Viner at The Guardian. Jess Brammer, who will head up Huffington Post. And Louisa Compton, who has just been appointed head of news of Channel 4. These are all incredibly impressive women doing incredibly impressive work. And because of the way we defined editor-in-chief and because we looked at brand reach, none of them are actually counted in our study. We can discuss this, but this is not to say to detract at all from their significance. And I think this is something that's really this is worth looking at. While we try to look at an overview globally, when you drill down to granular levels, there are incredibly important women doing very good work. And I'd like to make sure that we keep on highlighting their presence and their work as well. If we go to the findings, what we found is not great. What we found is that there's basically still a long way to go. Globally, only 23% of the top editors are women, despite the fact that 40% of journalists in all the markets are women. So there's a disconnect between the number of women in the profession and the number of women at the top. Every single market, bar none, has a majority of top male editors. And the most striking statistics here, which we can again discuss later, is that Japan has no female top editors, while 47% of the top editors in South Africa are women. If I run through the findings here, you can see here, like I said, Japan scores very low for reasons we'll discuss later, then Mexico and South Korea. The Finland, United States, and South Africa and the United Kingdom are relatively high. Germany, I would argue, should be higher. There are a lot of senior women in the profession. It's a country with a high level of gender equality and childcare provisions and a kind of awareness of the fact that it's important for women to enter the marketplace. And it's very striking that it scores so low in this study, really. Another thing we wanted to look at is break down this correlation between female journalists and top female editors. And so what we looked at is if there are more female editors in a profession, are there more top editors? And if you look at this scatter graph, you show that there's quite a strong correlation. The countries with more female journalists in the profession do have more women reaching the top. If you look at Japan, this partly explains Japan's figures. In Japan, the profession of journalism has traditionally been very male, and it's also very hierarchical, so people progress very steadily up a career ladder. So even though you're now beginning to get more women in journalism, it's going to take a while until that kind of reaches a level where they start taking up senior positions. The next thing we wanted to look at is see if there's any correlation at all between gender equality, whether the levels of equality in a country give you any idea of the number of top editors. And there we found actually there is very little. South Africa scores very low on gender inequality, but very high in terms of top female editors. Finland, which is one of the most equal societies, should, by this argument, be leading the graph, and it doesn't. So there's no correlation at all in that. And then the next thing we wanted to look at, which is the final kind of correlation point we wanted to look at, was what percentage of news consumers get news from the outlets with top female editors. Now, this really matters, because what we want to say is, if you are having a debate about what is news, who's it for, who makes the decisions, is really important. And what you look at, when you look at the statistics here again, it's very striking that in Japan, no people in Japan are getting news, online news with that's been decided basically by a female editor. And in South Africa, 77% of news users online are exposed to news that has been selected by a news organization with a woman in charge. I want to look at why this matters now in terms of where we are today. When we looked at the coronavirus, when the pandemic began, this fact sheet, first of all, started looking a little irrelevant and a little bit like it wasn't going to be the main topic of conversation. We were in the middle of a crisis, there was an emergency, nice to have things like feminism and equality was seen as not the thing to be discussed. But what we started seeing very quickly is that this pandemic has had a response where people need to stay at home, and home has been seen as a place of safety. And very quickly, our female writers and editors recognized that the home for most women is not necessarily a place of safety. It's either a place of work, unpaid, unappreciated labor, or it's a place of danger. So this piece by Helen Lewis, which was published in March, I thought was very good, talking about coronavirus as a disaster for feminism, because very quickly she threw up the idea that how are women in particular expected to carry on managing the home with all the increased domestic burden that comes there, and how are they meant to do that while also trying to take tentative steps back into the workplace, and also having lost their traditional forms of childcare, which in many countries and many poorer parts of the world is the extended family. It's grandparents, it's aunts down the road, and if you can't reach them and your children can't reach them, you've lost the kind of support that you had. The other area that we've seen a lot of reporting is on the area of domestic violence, again recognizing that the home is not necessarily the safest place for vulnerable people, especially when trapped in it with men who are normally used to having other outlets for their anger. This is a very striking cartoon I saw from Kazakhstan explaining domestic violence, because the story of domestic violence spiking in the home has really been written in several countries. It's very striking, and I'm very pleased it was highlighted so effectively and so early, so that the ability to escape to women's refuges and to escape has been seen as kind of an essential service, accepting that some women do need to escape these rules. This is the other place about recognizing that the domestic burden has got heavier with the coronavirus. And I do hope this strand of reporting continues. And it's not necessarily to do with the fact that women are in senior leadership roles, but it's also very striking that a lot of these pieces are written, and this was in The Guardian, which is edited by Kath Weiner. There's kind of recognition that this is still an important news story. And the final thing I just want to look at is the language that's being used in covering the pandemic at the moment. We have started very quickly with analogies of war. This is a war, we're in battle, we need to fight, we need to save lives. And I thought this column, again, by Marina Hyde in The Guardian in April, was really good, talking about the futility of talking about fighting the pandemic, but also crucially about the futility of saying anybody who's affected by COVID-19 must somehow fight it off, because this is something we've seen from cancer patients, that the language of war and aggression does not make people feel better when they're genuinely ill, because it also implies that if you succumb, if you don't recover, somehow you are guilty, that somehow it's because of failing in you, because you didn't fight hard enough. And here she's talking about a BBC correspondent who went to a public hospital in the United Kingdom and did a very good piece on how the service was overrun. But again, it's very striking that what she said is that he framed his film entirely in terms of war. This is the front line in a war, he began. Every day some battles are won and some are lost. And it was noticeable, as she points out, that the hospital workers themselves never used that kind of terminology. And also a lot of the hospital workers have been staff, have been female, they've been the nurses, they've been the care home workers, they've also been doctors or immigrants. These are people who were not kind of folded into the kind of analogy of kind of patriotic nationalistic wars. And this idea that NHS staff are somehow heroes who are going into battle and are willing to die for us is also slightly problematic, because it takes away the idea that they also didn't really sign up to be heroes. They didn't really sign up to die in the course of their jobs. They signed up to be able to treat the sick, but certainly to be given the protections and equipment they need in order to function. And sending them off into battle is not really what we train our doctors and nurses to do. I'm speaking very fast, and I would like to use this as discussion as well. I'd like to look at, again, going back to the Financial Times, which I think has been a very striking newspaper in that it is a financial newspaper with a largely male audience, dominated by business coverage, and yet it's recently appointed a female editor-in-chief. And I read the newspaper this weekend and was very struck by a change in its tone. While it still covered the issues as you would expect, with depth, with rigor, with kind of an eye on the impact on the economy, there were some real pieces about what it means for society, written in a tone that I don't think you would have seen before. And this editorial in particular gathered a lot of traction on social media. If I read part of it out, talks about the virus and the economic lockdowns needed to combat it, shine a glaring light on existing inequalities and even create new ones. Beyond defeating the disease, the great test all countries will soon face is where the current feelings of common purpose will shape society after the crisis. As Western leaders learned in the Great Depression, to demand a collective sacrifice, you must offer a social contract that benefits everyone. This isn't an unusual viewpoint, and it's one I've heard aired widely at the moment, but it was striking that it was in the Financial Times. I'm not the only person who thought this was unusual. And a lot of people, again, started to wonder whether this was a direct effect of having Roula Khalef in charge. And I'm going to end with this lovely quote from Zoe Williams, who's a writer for The Guardian, who in responding to this editorial said, "I interviewed Roula Khalef for Vogue and came away with this itchy-nosed fairy tale feeling. She was like a radical in corporate disguise, like meeting a deckhand on a pirate ship and knowing for certain he was actually a girl." So that's where we are. We're at a place where there are more women in charge, not as many as there should be, but ideally we're going in the right direction. But we're also going in a direction where people are expecting the women who are in charge to be somehow revolutionaries, to be renegades, willing to upend the social norms and look at a new way of doing things. And I would argue that in this kind of awful, dark times, that's exactly what we need. So the fact sheet is on our website. Please do go and have a look. And I'm very happy to answer questions. Simja is also here. And I'd really be happy if her microphone was unmuted so she can jump in as well on this, because she did pretty much all the work in gathering the data for the fact sheet. And yeah, happy to take questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mira. It's been a great presentation as always. I remind everyone, if you have any questions for Mira, you can just send them through the chat function in Zoom. So it's very easy, and just send them over there and I will ask Mira any questions you have. I will start myself, Mira. The UK is a very interesting place in terms of this, because as you said in your presentation, you know, The Guardian, the FT, the Economist, now the Sunday Times, all have female editors. And I would like to know, what's your view in this? Do you think that anything has changed in those publications after these great women took over?
Well, the Financial Times, I think, has definitely had a change. Roula has been in charge now for a few months, and even before that, she was deputy editor. So she has been at the newspaper a long time in senior positions. And what I would say is, I think the writing has got a lot more. I would say it's improved. It's got a lot more colourful. So it's the same writers making the same points, but being given a lot of space to kind of express their ideas more creatively. And I don't know the thinking behind this, but what it struck me is that it is a way of reaching out to audiences, new audiences who might have been put off by the slightly dry tone of the Financial Times, and bringing them in. So I thought it was a very useful exercise there. A lot of the other people have not yet been in post-Victorian. Newton has not started, Louisa Compton hasn't started yet, but again, Louisa Compton replaces Dorothy Byrne, who was head of news of Channel 4, and she has again been very vocal as head of, as the middle-aged female head of head of news at a public broadcaster. She's been very vocal about the lack of diversity in newsrooms and the harm it causes and the mistakes journalists make when they're not diverse enough in themselves.
Yes, definitely. And we recommend everyone this transcript of a seminar that she gave on at the Reuters Institute that is on our website, Dorothy Barnes' seminar in October last year, I think it was. We have a question from Susan Mole, and she's asking, I mean, we always hear that media leaders are recruited due to qualifications. So did you ask whether gender was taken into account when recruiting leaders?
We didn't ask that question in the fact sheet, and the fact sheet doesn't look at recruitment decisions as such. So we didn't ask the board of each of these media organizations, how did you recruit these people? We just looked at where they were in situ. I would disagree about the idea that media leaders are recruited due to qualifications. I think career progression in a newsroom is very hard to define. It's hard to understand. It's a combination of being a good journalist, of being a good networker, and in many cases has been having the right kind of face that fits within a newsroom, but also being the kind of editor that a certain proprietor might like to work with, for example. So I think this is a key point. The recruitment of media leaders is not clear, and in several countries like India, for example, Journalist Fellows India have spoken about the fact that very few jobs are advertised. They're, they're handed out by word of mouth, which makes it very hard from people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and castes to even know that these jobs exist, never mind applying for them. So I think recruitment is one area where it would be more useful to have kind of clearly defined criteria.
That happens in Spain totally, so I understand what you say. We have another question from Michelle de la Rosa Lewis, and she's asking, on a practical decision-making level, how to tackle superiors who dismiss ideas because they are conveyed with emotion when emotion is considered a weakness. And I think that's a very interesting question, especially in this time, because we are seeing a lot of emotional stories about the pandemic, every day. So what do you think about that?
I think this emotion means lots of different things, and what we want in our reporting and in our reporters is emotional intelligence and empathy. So we want journalists who can understand, who can go out, carry out good interviews, understand and empathize with the people they're speaking to, and then also know how to transmit that story emotionally, in the sense that they understand how the readers may receive a piece of information, how best they may receive it. What's unhelpful, I think, is a manipulation of audience emotions. So presenting something that's deliberately designed to distress or anger or inflame emotions by framing a story in a certain way or putting it out of context is irresponsible. I know that's not quite what you're asking. You're asking whether emotions are seen as a weakness. I think it's a hard thing to say, because a lot of television presenters are women. That's one area where, often the gender balance is skewed the other way. If you look at the people presenting the news in several countries where there may not be several male editors-in-chief or several male reporters, a lot of the TV anchors can be women. So I'm not sure that, and they're selected partly for their looks, but also partly because they kind of are seen as presenting the news with a kind of more emotional way. So I'm not sure it's a weakness there. I think what you need to be able to convince editors about is the fact that this is the best way to tell a story, so that the emotion is the way that the readers will stay with a story, who won't click off a screen, and that you're and in conveying the emotion behind a story or behind someone you're interviewing, you're making it a better piece.
I would like to ask briefly about South Africa. Why do you think those figures are what they are? I mean, it's the best country, definitely, in terms of gender equality at the top editor level. Have you done some research, or have you talked to some of the former fellows or people who you know about the industry over there?
Yeah, I think South Africa is interesting because it's similar to Germany. I'll talk about Germany, but it's a country that had a very clear break from the past with the end of apartheid and the kind of creation of a new government, not just a new government, but a new society with a new set of values and a very conscious dismissing of the old. So while it's still a deeply patriarchal society and the place of women is still, you know, being a poor African woman is still one of the hardest things to be on earth. So I don't want to overstate the case, but in terms of the media sector, you've had a lot of new media, a lot of new organizations being set up, relatively new, you know, relatively recently in the country's history. So you start from a different starting point. And again, you have a lot of digital players that are very good, but I think it's where you start. Germany, if I can just stay on that question, Germany, it's almost the opposite explanation going the other way. So in Germany, when you look at gender equality during the time of the GDR, before the Berlin Wall came down, gender equality was much higher in Eastern Germany than Western Germany. More women went out to work. There was state-backed childcare. It was seen as more of the norm, and that applied to the media sector as well. So a lot of the women, you know, were rising up the ranks in the media. But when the wall came down, media in particular in the GDR was utterly discredited. It was seen as a Soviet propaganda machine, and the only media that really survived were Western media houses. So when you look at Germany and you look at the heads of industries who are women, they tend to be from the former East Germany, because that's the area where they carried the path. Angela Merkel is West German, but she grew up in East Germany, so she's a very striking example. However, because the media sector in particular was desiccated and discredited, you didn't have that path up for women, for East German women there. So I think so you had a kind of West German model, which is far more patriarchal and traditional. So I think that explains the German system as well a little bit.
Yeah, makes total sense. We have a question from Liz Martins. She asked, one of the findings of the study is how readership of news outlets where women lead varies according to country. What does that tell us about every of those societies, in your opinion, and about you know, the kind of news that are produced in those societies?
It's a really good question, and Simja, if you have any more thoughts, do jump in. We didn't want to extrapolate too far, so we just looked at the news. What we would like to look at with the data is see if this has any kind of wider impact, whether the countries where women lead more outlets are, you know, whether the news is trusted more, for example, or whether it's less polarized. But that's not something we looked at in this study, but it's something we'd like to kind of keep looking into. Simjo, was there anything else you wanted to add on that?
The main reason we looked at how much, the reach of news outlets where women are in leadership positions was to see whether or not women were mostly in leadership of the more fringe outlets, or whether or not they have more reach. Like if they were leading, let's say, a big media company, they would have more reach than someone who would lead another female leader who would lead a more fringe news organization. So we want to look at that with the DNR data. That's why we combined those two. And our results confirm that in some countries, the news outlets with female leaders have more reach than the others. That's, I guess, my contribution.
Thank you.
Well,
I think the starting point we were at is that all news outlets are looking for more audiences, and in many of these countries, the large untapped audience is women. And how to reach women is the question that NHK in Japan, the Financial Times, several news outlets are trying to look at this, and we're trying to see whether having women, you know, at the top might be one solution.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Simja, for stepping in, obviously. We have a question from Bim Gautam from Nepal, who's asking, in developing countries, only less female leadership. In your opinion, how can we increase female editors in developing countries? I think this is a very pressing question, actually, and we have people with us from those countries, and it's probably not so easy as in the West. So what would be your answer, Mira?
I don't know if it's harder. I think there are a lot of things that apply here, which is, firstly, it's education. So you need to, you know, if journalism is a professional job that requires some form of higher education. First of all, starting with make sure that girls stay in school and kind of receive the skills, receive the presentation skills and writing skills needed for journalism as well. And then that they enter the profession and that they stay in the profession. And ideally that they're mentored all the way through, given the same opportunities as men. I think there's an interesting question about social norms and how acceptable it is for a young woman in particular to go out into a crowd, say, and interview unknown men. And firstly, whether it's considered socially acceptable, and secondly, whether it's considered safe for her to do that. And this is something we saw in Egypt, we see in Pakistan, you know, some kind of quite high levels of harassment of women in public spaces. And therefore it makes it harder for female journalists to be in these public spaces. So to get the number of female, you know, you can't have female editors until you start having female journalists all the way up through the profession. So you need to make sure that that they have the support within the newsroom, but also socially, that it's seen as acceptable for women to be in a public space and to be asking questions and to be presenting their own opinions and that of others as well. So I think, and that's something the media can help with by writing that, by basically kind of making the case for the idea that women should be in the public space as well.
Yeah, totally right. We have a question from Monica Elena, and she's asking, she's asking the gap, as she's saying, the gap between the share of female journalists in the newsrooms and the women in senior posts is interesting. To what extent the benefits and work flexibility an outlet is offering, for example, in terms of childcare, play a role in that decrease? Is it an aspect that would be worth looking into, I guess, in future reports or facts?
I mean, I think what's interesting is if you look at the difference between online and offline media organizations, digital-only publications are more likely to have a woman at the top than legacy media organizations. And that gives a little bit of a clue as to what might be going on here. So I spent most of my career in daily newspapers, which have a working day of about 10 o'clock till 7 o'clock, with an assumption that you go to the pub afterwards. You take a long lunch break and you go to the pub afterwards, which is great when you're single, but harder when you've got family responsibilities. Same with television studios. If you're on, I'm using UK examples because they come to mind, but I know this is true of all of them, but Newsnight, for example, the kind of the flagship BBC late evening news program, is aired at 10:30. So it's very, very hard, you know, it takes up the entire afternoon and evening. Online publications have different working hours in that they tend to start earlier and finish earlier. They tend to have more of a kind of effective rota system, more of an effective handover if you're doing a 24 hours a cycle, but also crucially, they can be done remotely, as we're all finding, more easily than legacy media. So that's an issue of flexibility. I think there's inherently more flexibility in online publications than there is in legacy publications. So it's obvious that their flexibility is an issue. Childcare, I think, I always find that the best equalizer in childcare is making sure men take paternity leave. So just anecdotally, I worked in Germany in a Berlin newsroom with an American boss who did hire men and women, but was very worried that the women would go off on maternity leave. And in the end, no woman took maternity leave, but 5 young men did, which I was delighted with. It was the best education he could have had, in that it's not a women's issue. So I'd be hesitant to say, we have to change childcare, because that immediately starts saying this is a women's only issue. I'd rather that we had a conversation where men are entitled to take the same time off and are expected to take the same time off to look after children, because then it makes it easier for everyone.
That's right. We have a question from Akila Lakshmi from India. Do you think in a country like India, caste and gender play a role in the newsroom, especially in leadership roles? And I think I really recommend Akila Tejas' talk. Tejas is a former fellow, a journalist fellow of the Institute, that he gave a talk about this, but I'm sure that Mira can summarize or give some more ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really recommend Tejas Herad's work on this, and we'll be publishing his report, but he's also done some speeches that we have on our line looking at caste in the newsroom. And caste in Indian newsrooms is a huge problem, because basically there really are not enough lower caste journalists. a full stop, and they're certainly not there at the high level. And this is for several reasons. Firstly, the issue I mentioned, that many jobs in India are not advertised publicly. They're handed out through word of mouth, and so it's harder for people who are not in that circle to hear about them. And the second thing is culturally, even if you are from a kind of one of the lower castes and you enter the newsroom, it's very hard. You've not grown up with the social norms, so it's very hard to feel comfortable and understand how to network and how to push yourself forward. The third area on that is a lot of lower caste journalists who do enter newsrooms are asked to write about caste stories. And this is something that kind of female journalists identify with, as well as with journalists from all ethnic minorities. You go into a newsroom and you're asked to write about women's issues or minority issues. And this is problematic because you then get shoehorned and you don't ever get put on the big political stories. Tejas looked at this and looked at the kind of the senior editors in India in media houses, and it was striking that there were very few lower caste senior editors. The problem was much worse in Hindi language and Indian language publications than in English language publications. English language publications, sorry, it's the other way around. English language publications were much worse. So English language publications were kind of exclusively dominated by upper class and Brahmin journalists. There was some variety in others. The area there might be some growth in this is if you look at the kind of Google's idea of the next billion users in India, they say very strongly that the area for growth in the Indian media market is local language audio. And by local language, I mean the real regional local languages, not Hindi or Punjabi, but the smaller languages. And audio. And this is obviously an opportunity for the kind of traditional caste systems to break down, because the people who can produce this audio with the right accent and the right fluency are people from these small communities, not necessarily Brahmins in the big cities. So I'd hope that's an area where we might start seeing some change.
And on Indian media landscape, I also recommend a great piece from a former fellow of us, Champreet Arora, that is on our website too. We have a question from Annika Rororen. She's asking, what do you think is the best way to increase the ratio of female leadership in media? Any best cases or best practices? And what attributes do you think are key in terms of improving this ratio?
It's a good question. Again, if anybody has examples from other countries, please do jump in. I think the best way to increase the ratio is firstly to have women in the newsroom and make sure they stay in the newsroom. So looking at all the issues as to why women might drop out of newsrooms, making sure that women journalists get given the big beats, get given politics, economics, the beats that drive you forward. What attributes are key? I would argue that it's more the other way around. We need to start accepting that kind of there are different attributes that are needed to be a good leader. So for example, we don't want a situation where it says you have to stay, you have to go out drinking every night with your colleagues and with your bosses in order to be seen as a viable leader. For example, I think you need to be able to accept other attributes. I mean, the other issue, which again, we didn't really look at in this fact sheet, is do women leaders have different leadership styles? Are they more, are they more likely to seek compromise? And I don't think, if you look at kind of business studies on leadership styles, they often say that women are not necessarily more likely to go for kind of coalitions and compromise. They're often likely to be as confrontational and as decisive as men. So I'm not sure about that area.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have a question that I particularly like because it's a question on newsroom culture, which is always super difficult to change. It's from Lola Fernandez, and she's asking, how do you think female media leaders could change the culture in their environments? Have you detected any internal policies to avoid the possibility of tokenism, particularly in these times of media crisis?
By tokenism, I take it you mean the idea that someone has been given the top job.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, that's what I'm taking it to mean. I think actually it's completely the other way around. The media is in such crisis. There are such difficult decisions to be made. I don't think it's a moment at all that you would give the job to somebody you did not think could really handle it, because it's the entire survival of the entire organization is at stake. So I think it's I don't think any female editor who's taken a job at the moment can be accused of, you know, having it easy. I think there's another danger to that, and you see this with companies like Yahoo and Hewlett-Packard, that female leaders are often brought into an industry at the moment of crisis. So it's essentially a sense of like, the men have screwed up, now let's let a woman have a go, which is also problematic, because it then means that female leaders are coming in with and having to work with much tougher conditions, are far more statistically likely to fail because they've been handed a company that's saddled with debt and has been mismanaged for decades. So so I don't think the issue is tokenism as such, as, you know, women being handed a poison chalice and then being held up to fail. The first part of your question, could female media leaders, could they change the culture in their environments? Again, I don't think it's kind of exclusively, it's not just about women, it's about different types of personalities. And so how they change the culture is really to do with what they are like as a person as well, and how they run newsrooms. I think one thing they could definitely do, and they probably do subconsciously, is rethink whose voices are heard in a room. So if you think of a news conference and you think about who tends to speak the loudest and whose ideas get listened to, I would like to think that if you have a more diverse leadership, that they then encourage more diverse writers to be heard.
We have a very diverse audience today. We have a question from someone in Vietnam. Her name or his name is Sen Nguyen. And the question is, I often use Vietnamese to approach, build rapport, and interview people. I'm an English speaking journalist in Vietnam. However, the Vietnamese language is hierarchical, which doesn't allow a lot of space to be confrontational with older people. This is also reflected on how women speak in Vietnamese as well, and there is a social norm where women are not expected to be too fierce or confrontational. All of these factors have made me more inclined to use English as a language of connection and interview. Does anyone else have the same or similar experiences? I think it's a very interesting question and very nuanced, and I'm sure that in other kind of cultural environments, other people have the same questions about gender issues. What do you think, Mira?
Yeah, please do. Everybody who does have experience on this, please jump in on the chat and we can unmute you. I think it's a really, really interesting point. I think it shows that English is sometimes seen as a more neutral language because it doesn't come loaded with the traditions of your culture. I used to work in Kenya as East Africa correspondent for a British newspaper, and this was something I noticed especially in Uganda and rural Uganda, where in many places there's still a culture where the women kneel before the men when speaking to them. And it was very hard for Ugandan journalists in that area, women Ugandan journalists, to go and kneel before a politician and then try to have these conversations, you know, where they're trying to hold them to account. So absolutely, I can see that it's a really interesting, valid point. Personally, in those situations, the rules didn't apply to me because I was an outsider. And when I've reported there, and certainly when I've reported in Asia, I've made it quite clear I'm British and spoken only English, not spoken Tamil, which I speak, to make it, you know, to kind of send off this idea that I'm an outsider, so please don't use those very traditional norms on me, and that works. But I do recognize that it's an absolute problem in a lot of countries, and it goes back to a lot of what I said about the idea of women should be allowed to be in a public space. They should be allowed to ask critical questions. They should be allowed to walk around crowds and speak to strangers. And then the next stage of that is absolutely that they should also be allowed to be confrontational and fierce when need be. I don't know what the solution is. I would have thought humor sometimes works. And I also would have thought having powerful men openly say, I accept this kind of language from women around me would help in these societies. But absolutely, it's a really good point. Thank you.
May I jump in?
Sure, of course, Sam. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I realized that if a person do hold two passports, they can use the trick that you just said. Oh, okay, I'm British. Don't apply those rules to me. But unfortunately, I only have Vietnamese passport, so I can't pretend to be
Exactly.
another nationality. But I do want to point out the advantage of being in those kind of situations, because I'm usually the youngest female. Whenever in whichever room I'm in. So I usually, depending on the situation, I was use that as an advantage in a sense of like, if they were to see me as a woman and younger, probably inexperienced, as a first impression, that will actually allow them to speak more, and I will play dumb. I'll be like, oh, really? What did you mean by that? So in interview, it helps a lot, because then it invites them to speak more, because I think I'm stupid.
I think that's a really good point, Sen. And can I just say that I think pretty much every woman on this call who's a journalist will have done this at some point. It always works.
I think that's definitely the case. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sam, for jumping in. We have a question from a certain academic, Rasmus Nielsen. I think we know him, Mira. So Rasmus is asking,
Never heard of him.
Do you think, Mira, Rasmus is our director, by the way, for some of you that probably don't know him. Do you think, Mira, the manifest difficulties many long-established news media have had in the last few decades in adapting to a changing world, new technologies, etc., may in part be due to a history of too many mediocre men in leadership positions?
In a word, yes, I do, absolutely. I think what you have with these mediocre men is a sense that as technology changes around them, they're trying to fashion it in their own image. So when you have a newspaper and you think you need to go online, the assumption is, well, I will make the digital product look like the print product because that's what I'm used to. And so it's everybody else's job to create a product that's familiar to me, and then it'll be a matter of time before the audience, learns, that this is still the right way. And I think the reason it's mediocre men rather than women or anybody else saying this, I think it's this idea that if you are the majority and you've always been comfortable and you've always had the rules of society molded around you and your needs, your physical needs, your physical ability to hold a broadsheet, your need to, your ability to sit peacefully at the breakfast table and read a newspaper, ignoring the children, then you just you don't think that there might be another way of doing things. And I think when you look to the transition from legacy to digital, it wasn't at all about turning a print, how to put the print paper online. It was about completely different ways of transmitting information to your existing audience, but also your existing audience are getting old and dying off. So you really need to find ways to find new audiences as well. So yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay, we are almost finishing. We have a question from Parvati Vajindram. She's asking about socializing. Is it very important for women I think we touched on this topic, but she's asking, is this very important? Is it very important for the women to adhere a modern socializing style to work their way up to promotion? Things like, clubs, drinking, extra hours at the office, etc.
I think, again, newsrooms are changing. There are a lot of new online sites with very different work cultures. I think long hours is a problem everywhere, online, offline, because news is a rolling business and it's competitive, and journalists naturally kind of are fueled by adrenaline most of the time. So I think the idea of managing your hours can be difficult. I think the drinking culture in particular is definitely changing. Partly it's a generational thing. Certainly in most of Europe, the younger generation just don't drink as much as the older generation do. It's not seen as inherently part of socializing. I think certainly as you get other cultures coming on board, kind of Muslim cultures and Asian cultures, that idea of socializing and drinking is definitely has definitely changed. But going back to the point we made about caste in India, I think there's still an important thing about the culture of newsrooms, which is not just about going out drinking or socializing with friends, but having read the right books, living in the right neighborhood, knowing the right cultural references, having grown up in a, having grown up in a family that took you to theatres and plays. So that's still a bit of an issue, and that's something that really needs to be addressed. But I do think the drinking culture in particular is changing, and that's a good thing.
That's a great point. We have more than a question, it's a comment from Dorothy Bland, and I think it would be worth it if, Dorothy, you can unmute your microphone and tell it yourself, because I think it's very interesting. Are you there, Dorothy Bland? Hello? I think she was here with us.
And ask her afterwards. But it's an interesting point she's saying.
Yeah, well, I think it's really worth it if she can actually...
Critical skills to survive and thrive in digital news leadership include flexibility, adaptability, continuous learning and experimentation. None of these have to be or are exclusively female traits, but going back to the point about mediocre men, I think adaptability is something that's often found by people who are new to any environment, whether that's women going into a male workforce, whether it's immigrants moving to a new country. I think people who are new to a system are more willing and able to adapt and be flexible because they have to.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you have any more questions or comments. I think Sen was raising her hand at some point. Sen, feel free to jump in if you want. We're about to finish the seminar. But if not, I also have a question. Mira, you told before that this is just the first fact sheet that we are doing and we are planning to do more. So I'm curious, do you have any roadmap in mind? I mean, which kind of more countries we are going to do or more aspects of this question?
The key thing we would like to do is map this over time. So the same way our digital news report maps changes in news consumption over time, we would like to map this over time. This was, Simja did an amazing job in a very short time putting together this fact sheet. It was a learning curve in terms of figuring out who is actually running a news organization. And the BBC is a very interesting example because Tony Hall was Director General. So the press office was very adamant that he's editor-in-chief. And we really wanted to say, but Fran Unsworth is head of news. And that would make such a big difference to our data if the BBC could be headed by a woman. So so we want to kind of fine tune how we decide, where we look at the person in charge of news, but it's certainly something we'll look at over time. And like I said, the thing I'd also like to look at it going forward is what this means for audiences. Are our audiences more likely to trust something written by a woman? Are they more likely to spend more time online on outlets edited by women? So I'd like to kind of see if there's more correlations there. And then, there's one question. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, this is slightly off topic, but we have one of the people with us asking about the fellowship program and if the fellowship program has been affected in any way, by the coronavirus crisis, obviously. And I think it's a fair question. Obviously, it's not about the seminar itself, but you are the the head of the program, and I would like you to address that at least briefly. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Has the fellowship program schedule been affected? No, we're still sticking to the terms. We just sent out we're still looking at applications for next year, and we're carrying on. In terms of what we're actually doing, the Reuters Institute is now a work from home institute. None of us are going into the building, and that includes the fellows. So what we're basically doing is moving a lot of the digital seminars online and carrying on the discussions and the groups online. And then hopefully the moment, these restrictions are lifted, we can go back to normal. But very much the Institute and the fellowship has been really crucial actually in these last few weeks. What's been very striking, it's been very scary times for everyone, but I think all the fellows on this call will agree that it's been really important to be part of this community, to connect with us and each other and keep talking about journalism. So we're still, and in terms of next year, the program is still on schedule in terms of sending out letters on offers and keeping on going. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll go back to normal very soon.
That's great. One final question from Gladius Rangini. It's another question from India, actually, and it's kind of related to the previous one. But what do you think is the reason why there are so many women journalists at entry-level positions in India? But the numbers drastically reduce as the ladder goes up. And I'm sure that you have at least a couple of ideas from your conversations with
I have several ideas. I mean, firstly, it's not well paid. It's, it's unstable, it's erratic. women journalists, especially in India, get a huge amount of abuse online, far more than men. So there just becomes a point where you think, do I want to keep this? Should I have to put up with this? What if I have other options? Why don't I take it? And I think then there's all the other reasons that apply to women journalists everywhere, or women going up any career ladder everywhere, which is time spent on maternity leave, time out of the newsroom. I think those issues especially can be difficult in journalism, which is less and less a steady job with defined maternity leave and benefits and a return to work program. I think it's far more of a scramble amongst freelancers. So it's a harder job to do while you're also trying to raise a family in a stable environment. But I think the online abuse of women, again, I don't have the data, but whether women drop out of the profession because of the amount of online abuse they get, I think would be very interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much, Mira. It's been a pleasure to listen to the webinar. I'm sure that everyone in the call agrees. Just 3 things to finish. Well, first of all, thank you, everyone. We know how busy you are. We know how difficult these times are for every journalist. We thank you for your service and for the information you're putting out during the pandemic. Is super useful for everyone right now. So thank you for what you are doing. Second, we are going to send an email to everyone who signed up with the video of the webinar, with the slides Mira showed, and also with some of the links that she mentioned. So you can all read afterwards and do whatever you want and share with your friends and colleagues. And finally, wash your hands and stay at home if you can, and follow the advice of your government, because this is a really serious situation, and we all want you to be safe and to stay sane during this difficult time. We will be back on Thursday, next Thursday, with another seminar. We'll see which kind of topics we will do. Well, until then, we hope you stay safe and sane, and thank you so much for coming. Goodbye.
Happy Easter, everyone. Thank you.
Of course, and happy Passover. Bye. Bye-bye.